Well, good morning on the West Coast, good afternoon here on the East Coast, and good evening to all my friends in the UK and Europe. I'm Tom Strange, curator of the Sigel Music Museum, and I'm bringing three of our Viennese pianos to you today. We call them Viennese pianos. It could be more properly said that many of these sort of instruments are South German. Sometimes they're Northern France or they tend to look a lot alike, and yet there's little differences, and we're going to actually go through some things today and look at some of those little differences. Obviously, the German/Viennese forte piano with the Prell mechanic action is one that gets an awful lot of attention in the world, largely because Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven were very familiar with these sorts of pianos. And so here's a piano that, for all intents and purposes, is what they heard and what they had in their head as they're composing. There are interesting aspects of the German Viennese piano that make them a little bit different than the English piano, and I want to make sure that the world understands, as you guys listen to me talk about these things, that I feel I'm reasonably well up, although we're all learning. Every day we learn a little something new, but we're reasonably well up on the English pianos, grand and square pianos, and American as well. One of the nice things that the English did, in particular, even when the Germans came to London and built, they tended to put their name and address and the date on the front of the instruments. Or in other ways, after 1800 or so, they left us with understandings of about what date things are. Sometimes with the German/Viennese style pianos, those made in Augsburg and other places, and particularly provincial pianos, they're completely unsigned, and so they're anonymous, and they could come from a fairly wide period. Normally, when I say circa something, I can get within 2 to 5 years at most of whatever date we're talking about. But sometimes, I think with these early pianos, they can tend to fool us a little bit. I will be interested in hearing back from this group as you guys watch these videos, and give me some feedback on what you see, what you think. Remember that there's a certain amount of hive mind to what's going on. There is some recorded information, and then there's a lot that is not exactly recorded. Let's talk about our first piano here, which is really quite a nice instrument. This is a Walter & Son forte piano, 6-octave, made circa 1815, and from the design of the leg style, the caryatid type legs, supporting the mainframe itself, and we're essentially on 4 legs as usual with this, and then the organically curved pedal box with a lyre in the back. This is a fairly simple one. Some of the makers went to a great elaboration on these pedal boxes, and particularly the lyre in the back. This one is fairly simple and straightforward, but the rest of the piano is absolutely gorgeous. It has a gilt etching, either transfer to cowl, or this could be an etched lacquered paper that's put in place. I haven't really looked closely enough to see exactly how it goes. And then the beading, which was put on, it's a brass beading that's been gold plated, and so it still looks about as bright as it did in 1815 when this piano was built. We have 4 pedals on the bottom, and so we have everything on this one that you would traditionally find on a Viennese piano except the janissary. There's no drum and bell on this one, but we have the keyboard shift to the far left. We have the damper control in the middle here. have a bassoon stop on this side, which lowers the bassoon just over the brass strings. And then on the far right-hand side, we have the moderator, which pushes the strip of cloth. In this case, it's like a yellow, it's actually felt on this particular piano because it's been replaced, but it would have probably been a very tightly woven fabric on the original. And that puts a strip of cloth between the hammer and the string, so as the hammer comes up, it hits that and forms the moderator, which changes the tone of the music. So, absolutely fantastic piano, and as I think you can tell just from a little bit of playing that I'm doing, has a really convincing sort of piano sound, and I think it has a little more regulation than I need to do yet, but wonderful instrument for performing Beethoven, late Haydn, Schubert, particularly his early stuff, and then we have the Johann Shams from 1825 to take us into the more modern period. We had to do something on this piano that you guys know I'm fairly reluctant to do, which is remove anything that's of a historical nature. We try never to do that. But as I sat down and played this piano just a little bit through, it was very clear that it was impossibly bright. Something had gone wrong with the hammer coverings, and you could see that they were packed down. And when I took the action out, and looked at the hammer coverings, I was trying to see, can we brush it up? Can we get a little more fluff back in it? And of course, what's happening is that they're disintegrating in front of you. Grab this back up here. So let me just show you here quickly. Here's a piece of the leather covering that we used. In this case, I'm using some material that Graham Walker had provided to me. This is a muntjac. And I think it's a really nice leather. The leather that we want to use here is sort of, baby butt soft and yet firm without any stretch in either direction. Now, I have fairly powerful hands, and I can put a great deal of force on something. But as I pull on this leather, I can't budge it. It won't stretch and it won't pull apart. Let me compare that to the hammer covering that we took off. This was some of that. And as I put a little force to it, boom, I get two pieces nicely coming apart. What's happened here is, as you guys know, and Jason Leninger can tell you a lot, or Leninger can tell you a lot more about this. Leather is a chemically processed natural material. It's made up of collagen proteins, and those collagen proteins, you want to stabilize them and make them so that they won't putrefy. In other words, that they will stop rotting, and that they're very tightly linked together. And they have to be in that condition in order to get the sort of response that you want from a hammer. So the physics of the piano is such that the hammer comes up, it contacts the string for about 3 to 5 milliseconds, and then it falls away. And while it's doing that, the string is put into energetic motion and it begins to go. If it stays in the contact longer than about 5 milliseconds, then you're going to start absorbing the partial harmonics very quickly, and the string will sound very dull and dead. The hive mind, the collective, have come together, and we have some idea of what the right leather should be. And then we always have to know that as we remove something, well, that's something removed forever. So on this piano, I left the underlayers as they were. They were still serviceable. They were a little hard, but the underlayers hadn't seen as much ozone. They had not decayed as much. And I just left them in place. So we essentially put on a new top layer, and then we've shaved it so that it will fit. As you guys know, the way these things are built, the hammer comes up very, very close to the nut and the rest plank as it comes up the strike. And so it's important that the shape of the hammer covering work with the piano, or the piano hammer will actually come up and hit the edge of the rest plank a little bit. And so that's a little less desirable, because then you won't get a proper strike. Removing this action is an interesting exercise. So this little piece, essentially you move against a spring here and it comes out. And so this piece comes away. And then, not using the brass finials, but grabbing the piece down here, we pull it out with particularly with our knee positioned right about here. So that right as it comes to the edge, then I want to let this thing drop down. This one does not have the separate sled inside. So it's sort of like a self-contained sled, and everything is made so that it moves out and then it'll drop down suddenly. You want to keep that from happening unexpectedly, because hammers tend to want to fly up as it drops down, and then it comes forward and they'll break against the rest plank. So we haven't broken any hammers in this one because we've been very careful. But just letting you know that it's an interesting way of fixing the action into the piano. I'm not going to drop the action on this one. It's a little bit of a chore on the way out, simply because there's a fairly powerful spring here for doing the keyboard shift. I will, however, drop the action on our other two pianos, and so I want to talk about those for a little bit. We have this instrument, which is one that Frank Hubbard owned in the 1960s and early 70s. In fact, it was still with him when he passed away in 75. And his widow ultimately wound up selling this one to Marlowe Sigel. I should mention, and apologies for not mentioning, both of these pianos have come to us from the Sigel musical instrument collection and are now, of course, part of our museum collection. And both of them are wonderful pianos in their own right. This one has the moderator and the damper control. So you have moderator here on the right-hand side and dampers on the left-hand side, not unlike a number of the Stein pianos at the time. And then I think as we will open this one up and see, it has elements of Stein about it, but there's enough different that you have to say, well, it's from somebody that was sort of copying Stein, but not necessarily somebody or Stein himself. It has the double curve bent side, so a curve at the tail, and then a curve here to the bent side. And what does it sound like? So a wonderful forte piano sound. This one has been restored. Leather coverings had already been replaced when I came to it, and all I have done on this one is a little bit of repair and tuning work. It was essentially still ready to go. It was fairly extensively restored, and I know that a fair amount of the soundboard has been replaced on this one. So not exactly a Rosetta Stone for these sort of instruments, but still a very interesting sort of piano. Music desk here, very small, lightweight music desk. Unlike Stein, this one doesn't have the silk in it. And then the music desk just slips out like that. And then the mainboard cover would come up like so. And so now you are in a position to begin discussing removing the action on this one. It's bichord throughout, and there are elements of this instrument that seem early enough that it's tentatively dated, circa 1780. Would circa 1785 maybe work a little bit better? And I tend to always think that we push the date earlier and earlier simply to have, a really early instrument. We can't know. 1780s would be fair enough for describing such an instrument, because it looks like it was built. There's elements of the craftsmanship, there's elements of the whole design as it comes together that just suggest this was built in a more metropolitan kind of area. There's nothing, strange and queer about it. The key depth is about 6.5 millimeters, the same as the Vulture and Son. And the way this thing comes apart is pretty traditional. So we would always first check and look at our hammers. Yes, they're all where they belong. Then I want to reach in here and I want to take this little fellow by the front here, and I'm going to pull that forward. And I'm always going to kind of hold on to the action a little bit while I'm doing this. Yes. And let that action down gently. Here's the sled. This is the sled that brings the action up. Then we're going to look inside again, yes, and see that our hammers are where we thought they were. And then without touching a key, I'm going to bring this forward. And here's our action for the School of Stein instrument. Now, in just a moment, we're going to do a little bit of comparison with another early Viennese piano and with a real Stein. So we'll be able to compare, apples and apples. So I'm just going to put this over here for a second and say, all right, what do we know about this piano already? Well, first of all, I know that the rest plank has been replaced on this one. You can see that this is a fairly modern rest plank. They were kind enough to put the old veneer back on top. So to the untrained eye, it looks pretty darn original. Instrument was restored very, very carefully. And, Marlowe always found the best restorers and had the best work done. So, this one is another instrument on which we could concertize without any real difficulty. This third instrument, some of you may recognize this one. I was showing it fairly recently. This is an instrument that Joan Benson had. Joan Benson was a clavicordist, sometimes a forte pianist, and she had bought this one in the mid-1970s, bought it as being fairly original, and in the Brussels exhibition of 1785, it was displayed as a Stein piano. I do not think it's a Stein. In fact, I'm pretty sure that no one would think it's a Stein as we dig into it. But it is an interesting forte piano. When I say interesting, what do I mean? Well, in this case, the key depth is actually a little bit shallower. It's about 5.5 millimeters of key depth. The case wall on the upper side on these sort of pianos is always thin. This one is exceptionally thin. It's no more than about 1/4 of an inch. So like a heavy veneer more than anything else. And then we have this wonderful panel lid that looks to be original to the instrument, and I have no reason to believe that it isn't. And then what does this one sound like? So a really nice sound. It's got a really nice sound to it. With the lid off, it projects the higher partials a lot more strongly. And so this one is sort of interesting because here's the lid. It doesn't weigh very much at all. And it's entirely separate from the instrument. There is no hinge. There's no witness marks that there ever was a hinge.
I do have one question for
Yes.
you. Erica Sigel wonders, could Tim and Marlowe have done any work on this instrument without removing the sled?
Well, you can actually do a fair amount on this sort of an instrument without pulling the action from it. But Marlowe would have known all about taking the action out of these instruments, and Tim Hamilton is an absolute expert on such things. So this is really, really a very simple sort of thing to pull out and to put back in. One of the beauties of the Viennese action is that it's one of the easiest actions to draw of all of the actions in the river invented. You just have to be careful. That's all you want to do. So let me continue on this one just a little bit. This lovely instrument. We noticed that it appears that in the name board it's been silked. In this case, the silk has been replaced with like a blue standard work cloth, but it was probably intended for the sound to come out. It has a mouse hole in the back that's a little larger than normal and probably intended to always come out. So here's the name board, or the music rest, excuse me. Here would be the name board. There is no name on this one, anonymous as usual, with little inset panels. Bichord throughout. So we have 2 strings for every note. And then drawing the action on this one is a little bit different. And this is why I am pretty sure we're talking about a fairly provincial instrument. So normally one would do what I just did. You grab this and start to pull forward. But on this particular instrument, we find out that no, what we have to do is actually, this one's pinned. And so we pull the pins up and bring this out. Well, that's a pretty interesting way of doing that. But it's clear that it had been that way since the beginning. These little finger holes here look to me to be entirely original. And there's no witness marks on this front that says this was ever intimately connected with that. So I suspect that this one has always been pretty much as we're seeing it now.
Question.
Yes.
How is the silk attached?
So what they would do on most of these is there's like a little inner frame that would fit inside that rectangular hole, and you put the silk all around the inner frame, and then you put the inner frame in, and it meets a little bit of a resistance, a stop, so that you have a nice outline for the silk. On this one, the inner name board is exactly like that. The music desk has been a little bit altered, I suspect, because there was some damage, and those 2 pieces were lost. And so when they replaced it, they did a kind of a so-so job of that. So here we have our instrument. Again, we're going to look and make sure that we like where all the hammers are, and then lifting up slightly, we'll pull the sled. Here is the sled for this instrument, and it raises the action roughly the same as this school of Stein and of a regular Stein. So there's nothing about that that seems unusual. The hammers do come down well under the rest plank on this one, and on a Stein it's a little more compact. So the hammers are a little bit close to the surface. So we can bring this one forward, and you'll notice something right away. There's a gap here in the middle, and that gap is where we have a brace between the belly rail and the rest plank. And while that brace idea is something that was known for some time, some of the earliest pianos don't seem to have it. So immediately things begin to suggest that maybe this isn't quite so early as we thought. This is the business end of 1784 Stein action, and I have reason to believe that every part of this, other than the hammer covering, is in fact original. And so you see a fairly heavy, relatively heavy, wooden hammerhead, which was what Stein had moved to by this time. It's still a very elegant, very, very lightweight sort of hammer. And notice that the beak and the catch in the back, there's a pretty good ratio between that and the length of the hammer. So keeping this in mind, let's look at the lowest C on our school of Stein. All right, so here we are, lowest lever, school of Stein, moving to the right, And all we can say is that the hammerhead here is a little bit lighter. The damper raising beak is a little more sophisticated. In most other ways, it looks a lot like what we've got going on here. We've got the little step function here and a little bit of a pad back there to catch the hammer at its bottom. And then comparatively, these guys look a lot alike. This one is doing the damper mechanism a little deeper into the string. So what do I think about that? Well, what I think is that we've been saying that the School of Stein is 1780, and perhaps it still is with this lighter hammerhead, but you know, this the sophistication with this compared to the regular Stein tends to make me believe that there's something else going on here. It might be, you know, that 1785 or even 1790 is closer to the truth. Wooden capsule at the end, and in all other ways, you know, the things line up pretty well. Now, let's compare these guys with the lowest note on the Joan Benson forte piano. So here's the lowest note for Joan, and here's a Stein. And immediately we see some things that are rather different. First of all, this is much longer here. And then the hammer length is entirely longer than what the Stein was. And then, even more important, note this little whitish area in the middle of the hammer head. This is lead. So this hammerhead has been leaded to give it a little more oomph, a little more power. And then, in most other ways, you know, it looks an awful lot like what we've been talking about. You know, a fairly delicate damper lift wire, but again, it has that look of you know, maybe something that's perhaps even a little bit later. So what do we know about this instrument? Well, we have reason to believe that under the soundboard inside, there's something of an inscription that says Sylvester Kostler, and he was an Augustine monk down at the border between France and Germany, actually France and part of Austria, and apparently they thought that he had restored this instrument. I'm going to make a little prediction. We're going to go in there with a camera, and because we have such a nice big mouse hole to get into, and we're going to see if we can find Sylvester's name. But what I believe we're going to find is Sylvester's name and his appellation, where he came from, and a date of 1799. And I think that the first restorers on this one back in the 1950s thought that Sylvester had restored this, but I doubt that he actually says he restored it. I think he probably just dated it. If I were a betting man, I would say that this is a provincial piano probably from 1799. And that's when the thing was made. We're going to find out. These and many other questions, you know, kind of await you as you can do this, you know, forensic, you know, analysis of what you have in front of you, and then what's the good of it at the end? Well, the good of it is that we begin to build a body of information around these instruments, so that while they sound wonderful, you'll also want to know, well, when was it being used, who might have been using it, and you know, what kind of music would have been played on such an instrument. So clearly, looking at these two comparisons, you know, one is a much more stout, you know, sort of hammer. One was designed to hit a heavier string. I believe that we have a piano that's more nearly from the late 18th century than from the beginning of the fourth quarter, which was where everybody thought that this was this piano was like, from the Joan Benson collection, was like 1775. Do I have any other questions at the moment? Yes, ma'am.
Erica does have one question. You've said mouse hole. She's gathering that's not a hole made by a real mouse, right?
That's right. So most of our builders would leave underneath here where you see what we call the belly rail. That's the part where the front edge of the soundboard will connect to. They would leave a hole in there, essentially for air to go back and forth, for sound to go back and forth. And square pianos and grand pianos typically have this, and we call them the mouse hole because it's roughly the size of a mouse hole. In this particular piano, it's a little bit larger, and I will certainly be able to fish a camera in there and be able to do a little bit of forensic analysis in the weeks to come. Thank you again for tuning in. It's been right about a half an hour, and we want to keep it there. Thank you for your support. People have been sending in messages. People have been sending in money. We really appreciate that. As you know, we're all in a situation right now where we can't be open to the public. So any help that you can give us would be very much appreciated. If you have any other questions, if you have observations, and if you have contrary thoughts, please mail them in, send them to the Facebook posts, and we appreciate you tuning in. And we'll see you Friday, where we'll have Maria Perini and Nathaniel Ortega coming back for a second concert. You don't want to miss it.